The Simple Viewer for the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint has gotten some new and exciting features in this latest update, so let's take a look. I want to go ahead and give an overview of the entire interface for any of you who may not have explored it before. So the URL for the Simple Viewer is just blueprint.southatlanticlcc.org, and I've typed that into my browser to navigate to the viewer. I can also get there from the South Atlantic LCC website through the Conservation Blueprint page, which is typically the first place that we point people to learn about the blueprint. You can click on this link in the upper right-hand corner to get to the Simple Viewer. You can also get there from the Conservation Planning Atlas by clicking this link on the CPA homepage. So let's close out of these. You can see that the Simple Viewer really first drops you into this fairly zoomed out view of the South Atlantic blueprint just to give you a sense of where we are in the southeast. And then this sidebar on the left-hand side of your screen provides some information about what the Simple Viewer is, what the blueprint is, and how it was developed. It defines each of the blueprint priority categories for you. And then if you're the type of person who likes to read the directions before jumping into a new viewer, we've tried to help you out here. Alternatively, if you're more like me and you prefer just to jump in and start clicking, I think that you'll find the interface is pretty intuitive and allows you to do that. So you may notice that this viewer isn't particularly interactive right now, and that's because it's prompting you through this message to zoom in first so that you can select an area. There's a lot of ways to zoom in. Here I'm using my scroll wheel on my mouse. I can use these plus and minus buttons in the upper right. I can use a zoom box by drawing this little rectangle around the area I want to zoom into. If I've enabled permissions to allow my computer to share my location, I can use this zoom to my location button. I've not enabled that, so I'm not going to show you that today. Or my personal favorite, you can use this little location finder and type in the place that you want to zoom into. In my case, I'm going to choose Brunswick, Georgia. I'll select Brunswick from the drop-down menu, and you can see that the interface has zoomed me into Brunswick, Georgia, and dropped a pin. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out because it's zoomed me in a little further than I want, and I'm going to unselect Brunswick to get rid of our pin so it's not distracting. If I continue to zoom back out, you can see that by zooming in far enough, I now see selectable boundaries for each of the summary units to explore the blueprint priorities. In the terrestrial and the nearshore environment, my selectable unit is a Huck 12 subwatershed. In the marine environment, my selectable unit is an outer continental shelf lease block. So I'm going to select a Huck 12 subwatershed for our demonstration, just to show you some of the new things that you can do with the Simple Viewer. As soon as I select a subwatershed, the sidebar view changes and is now showing me information specific to this subwatershed. Most of this watershed, as you can see on the pie chart, is prioritized in the blueprint. We have 10% in the highest priority dark purple category, 41% of this watershed is in the hot pink high priority category, another 41% is in medium, and then we have 2% in corridors. So in total, only 6% of this subwatershed is not prioritized in the blueprint. Farther down, you can see some regional and statewide conservation plans. These are plans that also identify priorities in the subwatershed, so they might be of interest to you. Even further down, the Blueprint 1.0 workshop feedback shows input that we received during the first round of Blueprint workshops about this subwatershed and what makes it special. I will note it's not at all intended to be a comprehensive summary of everything that's important in this subwatershed. We just didn't want to lose this feedback, and so we've carried it through in the viewer, even as the blueprint itself has become data-driven rather than expert-driven. I'm going to scroll back up to the top. Next on our list is the Indicators tab. This is going to tell us about how the indicators are scoring in this subwatershed. The first thing that I look at is the ecosystems that occur in the subwatershed. I can see that 43% of this subwatershed is in the forested wetland ecosystem. We also have a good chunk of pine and prairie. More than a quarter of the watershed is made up of the pine and prairie ecosystem. We also have some estuaries, some maritime forest, and some freshwater marsh. In addition, we can look at indicators that aren't specific to a particular ecosystem, but are more intended to capture connections across terrestrial and aquatic systems. They apply to the entire South Atlantic region, like freshwater aquatic, landscapes, and waterscapes indicators. So we have a lot of indicators that can tell us about the current condition of this subwatershed. If I sort of scan the indicators, I can get a sense of which indicators are scoring highly and might therefore be driving the blueprint priorities. The average score for each indicator in the subwatershed is plotted on the line as a dot. So for example, we can see that forested wetland amphibians is doing pretty well. But what does that really mean? I click on it to learn more. So now I can read more about the Forested Wetland Amphibians Indicator and how it's developed. I'm reading that it draws on priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, or PARCAs, within forested wetlands. So it's telling me PARCA is expert-driven, it's a non-regulatory designation, it's intended to identify places that support good populations of reptiles and amphibians. Here I can see more details about how this indicator is scoring. 79% of the forested wetlands in this subwatershed receive the high value for this indicator, and 21% of the forested wetlands in this subwatershed receive the low value. Let's go back and look at some more indicators. What else is scoring highly? It looks like wetland patch size in our estuarine environment scores pretty highly in this subwatershed. I can read about wetland patch size. This description is telling me that, perhaps unsurprisingly, big connected chunks of wetland are better than smaller fragmented chunks of wetland. And within the estuarine marsh ecosystem, 79% of that ecosystem in this subwatershed receives the highest value for wetland patch size. I'll also point out, if I want to learn a lot more about the wetland patch size indicator and even visualize it spatially, I can click this link that'll take me to the CPA so that I can actually look at this indicator. Here I can also read a lot more detail about the metadata of exactly what data sets this indicator is based on, what known issues are we aware of, see all of the citations. So if you really want to get into detail about an indicator, feel free to explore them on the CPA using these links. I'll close out of this. So that's wetland patch size. Let's look at a couple more indicators. Keep scrolling down here. Let's see. Let's look at a freshwater aquatic indicator. This is one that applies more broadly across the landscape and isn't just specific to an ecosystem. Let's check out riparian buffers. It's telling me riparian buffers measures the amount of natural habitat surrounding rivers and streams, and it's also telling me that this indicator applies within the active river area, or basically the historic floodplain of the freshwater aquatic environment. So I see that 54% of the active river area in this subwatershed receives the highest score for this indicator, with more than 95% of natural habitat surrounding rivers and streams. One thing you might notice on this indicator is this dotted line that says good condition. You might also notice that the values up here are green and the values down here are red. The good condition threshold is essentially our attempt to tease out which range of indicator values correspond to healthy, functioning, and connected ecosystems. We used these thresholds and initially developed them for the state of the South Atlantic, which is our ecosystem report card, and we use them to calculate grades. Here we thought it would be helpful to include them to assist in interpreting, well, what do these indicator values really mean for the condition of the ecosystem? What's truly meaningful on the ground? So we don't have this cutoff for all indicators. As you could see, we looked at a couple already. Those were gray. Here we're bringing in that dotted line and the green and the red. But for those indicators where we had identified a threshold, we went ahead and included them here just to assist you in interpreting the scores. You'll see these good condition thresholds come up in a couple of other places in the simple viewer. That's basically all I wanted to show you with the indicators. Let's go ahead and move on to the threats tab. The simple viewer includes two threats in its charts. The first is sea level rise. This data comes from the NOAA Sea Level Rise Inundation Projections, and if you want to learn more about this data set in depth, I recommend that you go to the NOAA Sea Level Rise viewer. And you can get there by following this link. You'll want to open it in a new tab so it doesn't overwrite where you are in the viewer. This is a site where you can go ahead and download the data, or you can go to the viewer if you want to interact with it online. So I'm just going to go to this button and hit Launch to bring up the viewer, and then click Get Started. I need to zoom in to see the data. Let's go ahead and look at coastal Georgia, since that's where we were in the simple viewer, and it's a big data set, so it may take a moment to load. One thing I want to point out that you can look at in the sea level rise viewer is mapping confidence. These inundation projections are based on elevation measurements, and just like anything else, there's uncertainty and there's confidence intervals associated with those elevation measurements, which impact our confidence and our uncertainty surrounding the inundation projections. In the sea level rise viewer, you can visualize that by seeing areas with high confidence in blue and areas of low confidence in orange. And I can click this Identify button to learn more about the mapping confidence. You can also, of course, just explore the sea level rise data in this viewer and learn more about it. So I'm going to close out of the sea level rise viewer. I just wanted to point out that this is a good resource for you if you want to learn more about the underlying data in the sea level rise charting. And I also just wanted to clearly state that the uncertainty around the elevation measurements and the inundation projections are not captured in our threat chart. This was really just one of the simplest possible ways to display these projections. So what you're looking at in this chart is areas that are likely to be impacted by inundation at the mean high or high water line under different sea level rise scenarios. So mean high or high water just refers to the higher of two high tide measurements. So think of this as showing what percentage of the subwatershed is likely to be impacted by inundation at high tide for each sea level rise scenario, which is displayed here in feet. So in this subwatershed, we can see that about 24% of it is likely to be impacted by inundation at high tide currently under a 0 feet of sea level rise scenario, and then that percentage increases as our feet of sea level rise increase. I do want to say we're in no way advocating for abandoning conservation efforts in a watershed like this one that's projected to be impacted by sea level rise. Perhaps there are some really important opportunities in this subwatershed for assisting with marsh migration. We're just showing you what the projected impacts of these threats may be so that you can use that with your best judgment to help inform your conservation actions. The next threat we look at is urban growth. This chart is based on data from the Sleuth urban growth model, as you can see here. Sleuth looks at the patterns of road development from the decade starting in the year 2000 and basically says if those trends continue, what might the urban landscape look like at different time steps in the future? This is a study that got a lot of press. You may remember its predictions of a southeast megalopolis along the I-85 corridor that might connect Charlotte to Atlanta. So this chart again shows us the percent of the subwatershed that's likely to be urban by particular decades in the future. Now that we've looked at threats, we can move on to the Partners tab. So you can see that this subwatershed does have quite a bit of conserved lands within it. 15% of the subwatershed is comprised of conserved lands owned by states. 9% of the subwatershed is made up of conserved lands that are owned by a private landowner, 4% federally owned, 3% by the Nature Conservancy, 2% we don't know, and then 66% of the watershed is not conserved. This land protection status section tells us more about the gap status associated with those conserved lands. A little over 3% is in this most stringent category of gap where it's permanently protected for biodiversity. If I mouse over this, I can learn a little bit more about the types of lands that might fall into this category, like nature reserves, research areas, wilderness areas. 26% of the subwatershed is permanently protected to maintain a primarily natural state. This includes things like national wildlife refuges, many state parks, or national parks that get a little bit more use and visitation. 4% is in this permanently secured for multiple uses and in a natural cover, like state forests or forest easements. And then again, just like the chart above showed us, 66% of this watershed is not conserved. Here you can see land trusts that are working in the counties that intersect the watershed. These links are going to take you to a Land Trust Alliance land trust finder by county so that you could see maybe who you might want to partner with in this watershed. So I'm going to close this out. Next, let's say maybe that you really like this information that you saw in the simple viewer. Maybe you're working on a grant or you're working on a presentation where you might want to reuse some of this information. One of our new features is that we've added a download report function. So by clicking on this link on the upper left, that's going to export all of this information from the simple viewer into a report that you can look at in Word. The Word document format was important to us because we wanted you to be free to cut and paste and repurpose these elements for whatever you had in mind. So this report is specific to the subwatershed that you had selected when you did the export. You can see that it's telling you how many acres are in the subwatershed. It's reminding you the name of the subwatershed. As you scroll, you're going to see essentially a lot of the same information that you just looked at in the simple viewer. We have a map of the subwatershed, of the blueprint priorities within it, definitions of the priority categories, a pie chart showing the breakdown of priority categories within this subwatershed. One thing that you'll see in the report that you didn't see in the simple viewer itself is a lot of tables that tell you not just the percent of area in a particular category, but also the absolute acreage within your subwatershed. So here's one of those tables for blueprint priority. The next section, we're getting into more details about the indicators. You're going to see a lot of the descriptions of the indicators that were in the simple viewer. You're going to see tables. This one shows percent of area in each ecosystem and the number of acres in each ecosystem within that subwatershed, and then breakdowns of each indicator by ecosystem. So this is one indicator that we looked at in the simple viewer, and here's the table version of it. So you can see that in this subwatershed, there are really good high scores for forested wetland amphibians. And again, here you're seeing not only that almost 80% of the forested wetlands within this subwatershed are in this high value for this indicator, but also the number of acres. So that 80% is translating into almost 95,000 acres that fall into this category. The indicators pretty much continue in that vein. I'll pause here to again remind you about this good condition threshold. So this is looking at the scores for forested wetland birds within the subwatershed. And you can see that we've classified the top 3 values for this indicator as qualifying as good condition. The best value is being able to get Swainson's warbler, but being able to get prothonotary warbler as well as all of these additional species, that's still pretty darn good habitat. So we're totaling up everything that falls within that good condition here in this gray line. So you can see that really almost 80% of the forested wetlands within this subwatershed qualify as being in good condition for forested wetland birds. So if we keep scrolling through all the indicators, you'll see at the end the threat charts right here. You can see the sea level rise and the urban growth charts and the links to more information. You can see the content of the Partners tab, the links to different conservation plans, conserved land ownership, and land protection status. We considered this report sort of a pilot for reporting to work out the bugs and kind of figure out how it works. And if we're able to continue to refine and update this viewer as we hope to, we want to move toward a system where you could export a report for a custom area. Basically to export information from the simple viewer for your custom polygon or shapefile so that you can look at blueprint priorities and indicator values and threats for maybe a parcel that you're looking to acquire or a refuge or a subregion or whatever it is that's of interest to you. So we think that this is moving us forward to hopefully achieving that later on. That's about all I have to show you with the report. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of that and take us back to the viewer. One thing that we've tried to make a lot easier with this version of the simple viewer is to provide feedback and to get help from staff. And we do that with these buttons here in the upper right-hand corner. Feedback, what we're talking about here is things like, wow, those priorities don't look right to me. That should be higher or that should be lower, or I think you're missing this data. If you have that sort of feedback, we encourage you to reach out. We really welcome that input because the blueprint is a living spatial plan and it continues to evolve based on your feedback and review. Same goes for feedback on the interface itself. If you find something really clunky or confusing, we'd love to hear it so we can make it better. You can also use this Contact Staff button if you want to do something like get help using the blueprint in a grant, or to inform your priorities, or to help with a decision. That's really my job as blueprint user support, as well as the job of my colleague Louise Vaughn, who I think has presented to y'all in the past. It's really what we do, and we would love to hear from you and assist you in incorporating the blueprint into your decision making. Last thing I'll point out here is that we've also made the simple viewer mobile friendly in this update. I'm not going to be able to film myself using my mobile device, so I just wanted to let you know that you can access all of this information from your phone. The interaction with that information will of course be a little different just because of the differences between pointing and clicking with the mouse and the tapping and swiping that we do on our phone. But if you do want to play with this on your mobile phone, this is all there at your fingertips as well. Now, I have really saved the best for last, so if your neighbor has fallen asleep, please elbow them or nudge them. We've made a really cool leap forward in communicating why particular areas are a priority in the blueprint. So I've clicked out of our selected HUC and I'm going to mouse over this little button here that says View Pixel Level Details. If I click here, it's going to take me to this pixel detail mode where I can really get into why a particular pixel is a priority in the blueprint. Let's zoom back over into coastal Georgia where we were before. This question of why a particular pixel is a priority in the blueprint is something that we get from users all the time. One of my favorite quotes from a user interview was, "Why is this purple and is it my kind of purple?" In other words, he was asking, why is this a priority and is it for the reasons that I care about? Answering that question for folks has been a communication challenge for us as staff because in the past it's required you to really dig into desktop GIS to answer that question and toggle layers on and off. It was a little complicated, and we wanted to make that process of discovery way more transparent and invite people and welcome them to get under the hood and really dig into this data. So we fondly call this pixel mode the pixel hunter internally, and it's because you can see you have this little crosshairs in the center of your screen, a little target. And as the message at the top instructs, you click and drag using this little hand cursor to move the map behind your bullseye. Now, the summary mode for the simple viewer was telling you about average scores for a particular HUC, but now I can find out about the blueprint priorities and the indicators for a particular pixel. And since the blueprint is prioritized at a pixel level, this is really the finest scale that we can get to in uncovering why a particular area is a priority. So it's going to tell you priority for this pixel, which is easy to see from the legend, but the indicator summaries are really a lot more interesting. First, I'm going to look and see what ecosystem this pixel is in, because that's going to tell us what indicators apply here. So that's going to tell me that the indicators that apply to this pixel are forested wetland ecosystem-specific indicators, as well as all of those cross-ecosystem connection indicators that we talked about earlier, our freshwater, aquatic, our landscapes, and waterscapes. Again, you're seeing that some of our indicators are gray where we don't have a good condition threshold set, whereas some of our indicators have that green and red good condition binary so that you can tell which values of that indicator correspond to high levels of ecosystem health function and connectivity. This text at the bottom, below the bar, is telling you exactly what the value is for that indicator. So if we look at forested wetland birds, it's telling me that these 3 categories that we looked at in the report a minute ago are good condition. And the specific value that this pixel has on this indicator is this second to highest value with the potential for the additional presence of prothonotary warbler. So let's say that I want to dig into this indicator a little more. Again, I can click on it. I'm going to see that same description that I saw earlier in the summary mode, and then this is reinforcing what we saw before about the indicator value of this pixel. Once I've selected a particular indicator, one of the really interesting things that you can do is drag your map around and look at how that value might change. So notice that here I'm basically staying within highest priority areas of the blueprint. You can see that here, for example, we're not in good condition, whereas if I scroll just a tiny bit over, we are in good condition. So it's very interesting to see how these values change as you move from pixel to pixel and ecosystem to ecosystem and see what indicators are driving our blueprint priorities. So we can do the same thing with another indicator, perhaps one that we haven't looked at before. We can look at low road density. This is an index of essentially road density, where low is obviously better for ecosystem condition. So we can see that this pixel that I'm zoomed in on in my bullseye, it has high road density, so it's not in good condition. But if I pan over here, we see that all of a sudden I am in a low road density area and I'm in good condition again. Now, in order to showcase a lot of the really cool new features in the simple viewer, like the threat charting, I've really been focused on the nearshore and terrestrial environments because obviously we're not super worried about sea level rise, inundation, or urban growth in the marine environment. But of course, this is the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and so I did want to take a second to show you a little bit what this looks like in the marine priorities. I'm going to go ahead and stay in the pixel level view now and just pan over to some of our marine priorities. I've got to back out of this indicator, and I see the indicators that do apply in the marine ecosystem. We have marine birds. We can see that this pixel that the bullseye is on is scoring very highly on marine birds. It's above the 80th percentile. If I click on it, I can learn more about that indicator. And again, like I showed you in the terrestrial environment, I can kind of pan around and see how the values for marine birds changes as I move. I can also go back and select a different indicator. This isn't a particularly important area for marine mammals that I've selected right now according to this indicator. I can back out of this and look at potential hard bottom condition. This is an indicator that measures the protected status or potential stress on hard bottom habitat. This particular pixel that I'm looking at here is not predicted to have hard bottom, so it's not in good condition. But if I find another area where hard bottom is more prevalent, like here I can see that we're not only likely to have hard bottom habitat, but that habitat is likely to be in great condition as well because it has some additional protections. And in the pixel mode, just like in the summary mode, you can always link to the Conservation Planning Atlas from here to learn more about the indicator and to visualize it individually. If I turn off the pixel level detail mode, it's going to take me back to summary mode, and I can zoom in a little bit more into the marine environment so that I can show you what it looks like to select a lease block. I'm going to go back to our priority tab. Frankly, the charting for the marine is just not as interesting because we don't have the threat charting, but you can still learn about the breakdown of blueprint priorities within a marine lease block, and you can look at the summarized indicator scores within the selected unit. That pretty much concludes my demo of the new and improved Simple Viewer.